You can then take that image sequence from After Effects and import it directly into Meshroom. Now Meshroom is a free photogrammetry. Photogrammetry, okay, I've got it. Right. Now Meshroom is a free photography. It's going to be a long one. What's going on, guys? My name's Bruce, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to show you how to turn this into this. Didn't see a difference? Well, that's a good thing, because the first one is the original footage and the second one is a 3D scene created from that same footage. Having a 3D model of your scene is one thing, but having the camera data as well enables you to recreate your whole scene inside of Blender and easily composite it back into your footage. This technique plays a huge part in how I created this missile effect in an upcoming project, which I will be breaking down in a future video, so make sure you subscribe to see that. Now, I created this model using a piece of free photogrammetry software called Meshroom. If you don't know what that is, then there's tons of videos online you should go and watch first, as this won't be an in-depth tutorial on how to use it. I also suggest watching some videos on best technique to do photogrammetry as well, as again, I won't be covering that in this video. Now, photogrammetry is usually done with still images, as this almost always gives the best results. But as I'm recreating my footage in 3D space and exporting the camera, I need to use the frames from the original footage to build up my model instead. Now, this will never give you as good of results as using still images, mainly due to the fact that images will be a much higher resolution. But here are a few steps you can take beforehand to improve your results. Number 1, shoot in 4K or higher. The higher the resolution, the better the results, well, obviously. Number 2, set your white balance in camera and make sure you don't use auto white balance. This one is quite important. Number 3, crank up your aperture to avoid shallow depth of field. You want to make sure everything is in focus, else the textures on your model could be mismatched. Number 4, set your ISO to the lowest value to reduce noise, although this one might be quite obvious. Number 5, crank your shutter speed to avoid motion blur. Now, this one might sound a bit off-putting as it breaks the 180-degree rule, and believe me, I've created some great 3D models without doing this. However, you would still get a more accurate result if you do this, as you will avoid any motion blur and risk messing up your textures. You can then add in motion blur in post if you want. Number 6, shoot an S-Log or a flat profile, as the lower contrast helps the software identify points and objects in your footage. Number 7, try to shoot under diffuse lighting like an overcast day. Hard light creates harsh shadows and change in light can cause irregularities in your 3D model. Number 8, make sure you get an HDRI or a 3D image of the location you shot your footage at. This will help so much with the lighting and help to make any 3D objects you add into your Blender scene look more realistic. I use a free app called Google Street View, which you can download onto your phone. I'll leave a link down in the description. And my last tip is to avoid shooting any objects close up. This technique is all about creating a 3D model of your scenes, so I doubt many of you will actually run into this problem. But I found any objects close to the camera can cause quite substantial lens distortion and can make your camera solve inaccurate. Now I'm going to show you how to go about doing this in Meshroom and Blender. This is from footage I shot on my friend's drone and taking absolutely nothing of what I just said into consideration, just to show you how well this works. I'm using After Effects as my video editor, as I find this program so much easier to use and better for when I'm compositing. You can, however, use any video editor of your choice. I just prefer to use After Effects. I'll start off with my footage inside of a new composition, and I have already found the part I want to use. I shot this footage at 60 frames per second and conformed it to 23.976 frames per second. Therefore, in a 24p sequence like this is, it plays back in slow motion. Meshroom, however, doesn't accept video files, or at least not very well, so I'll need to render this clip out as individual frames. Firstly, make sure your composition starts at frame 0. If it doesn't, when you go to export your image files, the naming system might get confusing. If it doesn't start at 0, go up to Composition, then Composition Settings. Next to Start Frame, enter 0 and press OK. Now make sure all of your composition is inside of the work area. Then go up to Composition and click Add to Render Queue. I need to export this as a PNG sequence, so in Output Module Settings, I'll change the format to PNG sequence and hit OK. Now click on Output 2, find the location of your project and create a new folder. For the file name, delete everything but the .png, then press Save. This will ensure your frames have an easy to follow numbering system. Now enable caps lock on your keyboard to freeze the viewport window and click on render. Once that's done, locate your output folder, hold Ctrl and press A to select everything and drag them into the side panel in Meshroom. You should now see a little red icon on all of your images. This is Meshroom telling you that it can't find the camera intrinsics in the file and doesn't know what camera, sensor or lens the image was shot with. As this is a PNG sequence that I exported from a video clip, there is no camera metadata in the files. I'm not going to be worrying about that in this example today, but if you find you're not getting the results you want, then you can always inject your own metadata. I use a free program called AnalogEXIF, which I'll link down in the description below. Meshroom pulls camera data from digicamdb.com, so check your camera metadata you input match the details listed on that website. Again, I'll leave a link in the description below. Once you've added your metadata, the icon will turn green as Meshroom now knows the camera intrinsics of the images. AnalogEXIF, however, doesn't work with PNG files, so you need to export JPEGs instead. Now there's lots of different ways to use this program, but this is just the way that I like to use it. Firstly, go up to File and click Save. Meshroom needs the file to be saved so it knows what location to store the cache files in. These can get quite big, by the way, so make sure you have enough disk space on your drive. Now that's saved, right click on the structure from Motion node and click Compute. I don't like to process a whole node tree until I know I've got a good camera solved first. You'll see what I mean in a second. Now if you've got a lot of frames like me, then it could take a while and it could be worth leaving it for the afternoon or so. The speed of your computer will determine how long it takes to process. Once it's done, right click anywhere in the graph editor and look for the node Export Animated Camera and select it. You then need to take the structure from Motion output noodle to the input of the Export Animated Camera node. With this node selected, come over to the Properties panel and check Export Undistorted Images. Underneath, you can change the format of these images. This will export undistorted versions of your images that Meshroom has corrected based on the camera's intrinsics. This is a great way to see if your mesh is going to line up with your original footage before processing the next nodes. Now right click on the Export Animated Camera node and click Compute. This will export an animated camera of your scene and its corresponding undistorted images. To locate these, right click on the node and select Open Folder. Here you can find the images and the camera. I usually like to import the first image into my After Effects composition to double check, then toggle on and off the visibility to make sure they match up. If it doesn't, then you can go back and add the camera metadata to your images for a more accurate result. If you're still not getting the images to match, then you can always use the new undistorted images as a replacement for your footage instead. You may need to crop in slightly when you composite everything back together though. Now I know the camera solve is good, I'll right click on the texturing node and click Compute. This can also take a while, so again, it's best to leave your computer alone or do it overnight. Once it's done, open up a new Blender scene and delete everything. Now I need to set up my scene correctly before I import anything. Firstly, come to Output Properties and change the frame rate to match your footage. So in my case, 23.976. Now go to File, Import, Wavefront OBJ. Find your Meshroom project file, then locate the texturing folder. Inside of here should be your exported model and a material file and its textures. Select the OBJ file and click on Import. Now two things you'll notice. Firstly is the amount of vertices this model has. As you can see, it's very dense, and on a slower computer this could be an issue. The second thing you'll notice is in the material properties there are lots of texture maps. Now both of these things may not be an issue for you and you can carry on just fine with the model how it is. However, if you start adding more complexability, if that's even a word, complexability. However, if you start adding more complexity to your scene, you'll probably find things start to slow down. Now you could reduce the vertex count by decimating the mesh inside of Blender and then bake all the high poly mesh textures into one low poly mesh texture. But I've personally never had great results with that, and you can actually do all of this inside of Meshroom. Open up Meshroom, right click in the graph editor and search for Mesh Decimate. Connect the output noodle from Mesh Filtering and connect it to the input of the Mesh Decimate node. With the Mesh Decimate node selected, come over to Properties and choose the max vertices you want your mesh to be. I like to use around 100,000. To texture the decimated mesh, right click on the texturing node and click Duplicate Node. Now right click on the Mesh Input noodle and click Remove. Wire the Mesh Decimate output to the new texturing mesh input dot. Now with the new texturing mesh node selected, come over to the Properties panel. Here you can change the size and the type of the unwrap method Meshroom will use to unwrap your texture. This is also where you can choose to have it all on one texture map. I'll leave the descriptions of each of these on the screen so you can pause it. Bear in mind though, these do take longer to compute. Once you're happy with your selection, right click the new texturing node and click Compute. Now go back into Blender, go to File, Import, Wavefront OBJ, and find your Meshroom folder again. In the texturing folder, there will now be two folders, one with the original mesh and textures, and one with the decimated versions. If you don't know which is which, click on Display Mode and select Display As Vertical List. Then choose the folder with the most recent date and time. Select your OBJ and click Import. If you don't want the high poly model anymore, you can just delete it. Now I need to import the camera. To do this, go to File, Import, alembic.abc and find your Meshroom folder. Locate the folder called Export Animated Camera, find the camera.abc file and click on Import Alembic. If I hit 3 on my number pad, I can see my scene has been imported upside down. So hit A, R, X, 180, Enter to rotate 180 degrees on the X axis. I'm also going to bring my model up to match the floor. If you scrub through the timeline, you can see your camera now animates around your object. Something you'll notice though, with the camera selected, there's no keyframes in the timeline. If you come over to constraints, you can see that Blender is using a transform cache to animate the camera. If you don't plan on adding or modifying to this animation, then you can leave it how it is. But if you prefer to bake this animation down to keyframes, then I'll show you how to do it. Press Shift A in the viewport and add a new camera. Now hit Alt R to clear the rotation and Alt G to clear the location. Now select the old camera and copy the focal length using Ctrl C and paste it in the focal length of the new camera using Ctrl V. Now with the new camera selected, go to Constraints and under Transform Constraints, select Copy Transforms. Using the eyedropper tool, select the old camera and the new camera should snap into its place. With the new camera still selected, go up to Object, Animation, Bake Action. Check Visual Keying, Clear Constraints and press OK. Now you can archive or just delete the old camera plus its empties. Now I need to set up my scene scaling. Go into Shading View to get a better understanding of your scene. I need to try and pick out a feature that I can estimate its size. My scene is quite difficult as it's a cliff face, but this path would be a good reference. I'm going to estimate that this section of the path is around 1 meter in width. With my object selected, tab into Edit mode and press Alt A to unselect everything. Now in Vertex Select mode, select a vertex on your reference and press Shift S, cursor to selected. Tab out of Edit mode, then press Shift A to add an empty. Now press A to select everything while keeping the empty the active object. Then press Ctrl P to parent, keep transform. Now press Shift A to add a cube, and in my case, I'll make it 1 meter in diameter. As you can see, my scaling is quite off, but as my scene is now parented to my empty, I can scale my scene using my empty and using the cube as a reference. I'll just scale my empty until the path matches up with the cube. This is scaling the whole scene by the way, so the camera will still be aligned. You may need to adjust your view and rotate the cube to get a more accurate result. Once that's done, you can simply delete the cube as you no longer need it. Okay, if you decimated your mesh and only exported one texture map, then this next part will be quicker for you. Make sure your viewport is in shading mode, then select your mesh. Under material properties, check how many textures you have. If you have more than one, then you'll need to repeat the next steps for each texture. Go to the shader editor and select the principal BSDF node, then press Shift S and under shader, change it to emission. This will texture your mesh without shadows or reflections. You don't have to do it this way, but if you don't, then it won't match your footage when you composite it back in. To check the alignment of your camera, first select it, go to camera and enable background images. Click on Add Image, then click Open. Locate the image sequence that you exported earlier, then press A to select everything and click Open Image. Make sure your animation and image sequence both start on the same frame. If they don't, then they will be mismatched. Now press 0 on the number pad to go into camera view. To check the mesh lines up with your images, bring the opacity of the background images up to 1. Now scrub through the timeline to check they match up. This will give you a good reference on your camera solve. Now how you go about creating your scene is entirely up to you. I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial, but I will mention a few things to take into consideration when exporting and importing your render. Okay, so let's go into camera view. If I zoom in, you can see my model is slightly brighter than my background images. This is due to the way Blender is viewing the colors of my scene. So go to Render Properties, Color Management, and then change the view transform from Filmic to Standard. Filmic has much more realistic lights and colours, so I wouldn't really recommend changing this usually. But on this occasion I'm happy to do so as I need my scene to match my footage exactly. Now I usually export my files using PNGs. If you do, then make sure you're exporting them with Alpha and under Film, check Transparent. Rendering this scene as it is in Cycles or Eevee should give the same results as I'm only using emission shaders. Your scene and circumstances will obviously be very different, so try what works best for you. Once you've completed your scene and rendered it out, you can import your sequence back in After Effects by going up to File, Import File. Locate your rendered images, select the first image and click Import. After Effects will then import the whole folder as an image sequence. But as you can see, it's imported the sequence at 30 frames per second. If your composition is already this frame rate, then you can simply drag it into your composition, but as mine is 23.976, I'll need to change mine, else my sequence won't match up with the footage. To do this, right click the file, go to interpret footage and then select main. Next to assume this frame rate, type in the frame rate of your original footage or composition, so in my case 23.976, then hit OK. After Effects will now play this file back at that frame rate. Now drag your sequence into your composition and scrub through the timeline to make sure it lines up. And that's it. Now you don't have to stop there. If you've made a complex scene and you want to import camera data back from Blender with empties that you can track footage to inside of After Effects, then I've already covered it in the second half of this video. The timestamp for the section you need is in the description below that video. Now if you've done everything correctly but you're still having problems, then remember these few things. Number 1, if Meshroom is failing, check the command prompt and see what error message you are getting. If it's something quite obvious, then you can go back and try to fix it. Number 2, if you're not getting a very good camera solve, then try injecting the metadata into your images. Number 3, make sure you set your shader type to emission if you plan on compositing it back into your footage. Number 4, under color management, change your view transform to standard if your mesh doesn't match your footage. Number 5, make sure your camera animation and background images are starting on the same frame. And number 6, make sure your sequence in After Effects matches the frame rate of your composition. If you're still having issues, then check the versions of Meshroom and Blender you are using. I'll put the versions of Meshroom and Blender I'm using on the screen here. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. I'll also leave a link to some of the images I used down below so you can have a go yourself. But thanks anyway guys, and I'll see you in the next one.